Vanessa held the envelope in her trembling hands, staring at the familiar handwriting that had become as routine as breathing over the past 7 years. Every month, without fail, she'd written out a check for $250, sealed it in a cream-colored envelope, and mailed it to her late husband's mother. Every month, she'd honored the promise she'd made to Paul on his deathbed, but this month the envelope had come back, returned to sender, address unknown, and tucked inside was a note that would shatter everything she thought she knew about sacrifice, loyalty, and the woman she'd been supporting all these years. The note was written in rushed handwriting, clearly not from Paul's mother. It read, "Lady, I don't know who you are, but the woman who used to live here moved to a luxury condo in Buckhead 3 years ago. She's been telling everyone her son left her a fortune. Thought you should know. A concerned neighbor." Vanessa's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank onto the worn couch in her small Atlanta apartment. The same couch she'd been sitting on for 9 years because she couldn't afford to replace it. Not while she was sending $250 every month to a woman who apparently didn't need it at all. Before we continue with Vanessa's story, I need to ask you something. You're here, watching this video, invested in what happens next, but here's the thing. Over 70% of the people watching right now haven't subscribed to Philly Folktales. That's thousands of you enjoying these stories but not joining our community. If Vanessa's story is already pulling at your heartstrings, imagine having a new story like this waiting for you every time you open your app. Hit that subscribe button right now. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it means the world to us. Also, smash that like button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Georgia, New York, Manchester, Netherlands. We want to know where our Philly Folktales family is tuning in from. Now let's get back to Vanessa because what she discovers next will leave you speechless. 7 years ago, Paul had died at 42 years old. A heart attack that came out of nowhere, sudden and merciless, leaving Vanessa a widow at 38 with no children and a mountain of medical debt. They'd been married for 12 years, and those 12 years had been filled with the kind of love that people write songs about. Paul worked as a manager at a shipping warehouse, and Vanessa taught 2nd grade at an elementary school in East Point. They weren't rich, but they were happy. They had plans. They were going to save up for a house with a backyard, maybe adopt a child, travel to the places Paul had always dreamed about, the Caribbean, South Africa, places where he could trace the roots of his ancestry. But then Paul collapsed at work on a Tuesday afternoon, and by the time Vanessa got to the hospital, he was barely hanging on. She remembered holding his hand, feeling it grow colder despite the warmth of her grip, watching the monitors beep slower and slower. In those final moments, Paul had looked at her with eyes full of pain and regret, and he'd whispered, "Take care of Mama. Please, Nessa, she's got nobody else. Promise me. $250 a month. It's all she needs. Promise me." And Vanessa had promised, because how could she refuse the dying wish of the man she loved more than her own life? She'd promised, even though she knew it would stretch her already thin finances to the breaking point. She'd promised because that's what love does. It sacrifices. Paul's mother, Dorothy, had never been warm to Vanessa. From the moment Paul brought Vanessa home to meet her, Dorothy had made it clear that no woman would ever be good enough for her son. Dorothy was in her mid-60s then, a stern woman with silver hair she kept in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they looked at. She lived in a modest house in College Park, the same house where Paul had grown up, and she'd worked for 30 years as a secretary at a law firm before retiring. She wasn't destitute, but she also wasn't comfortable, or so Vanessa had believed. At Paul's funeral, Dorothy had barely acknowledged Vanessa. She'd stood at the casket, weeping dramatically, proclaiming to everyone who would listen that her son was all she had in the world, that she didn't know how she'd survive without him. Vanessa had felt guilty then, guilty for being the wife, guilty for having had Paul's love in a way Dorothy never could, guilty for being the one who survived when Paul didn't. So when the first month came around after Paul's death, Vanessa had scraped together $250, money she desperately needed for her own bills, and she'd sent it to Dorothy. She'd included a note. "Paul made me promise. I'll take care of you, Mama Dorothy. I love you." Dorothy had never acknowledged the money. Not the first month, Not any month. Vanessa never received a thank you note, a phone call, or even a text message. She told herself that maybe Dorothy was too proud, too grief-stricken to reach out. She told herself that silence was better than rejection, so she kept sending the money, month after month, year after year. She'd had to pick up a second job tutoring on weekends to make ends meet. She'd stopped going out with her fellow teachers for dinner. She'd learned to live on rice and beans and whatever was on sale at the grocery store. She'd worn the same 5 outfits to work, rotating them carefully, mending them when they wore thin. Her friends had stopped inviting her places because she always said no, unable to afford movie tickets or brunch or birthday dinners. "Why don't you date?" her best friend Latoya had asked her just last year. They were sitting in Latoya's comfortable living room, and Vanessa was wearing a cardigan she'd owned since before Paul died, the elbows patched with fabric that didn't quite match. "Girl, Paul's been gone 6 years. He'd want you to be happy." But Vanessa had shaken her head. "I can't even afford to take care of myself properly, Toy. How am I supposed to date? Besides, I made a promise." Latoya had given her a look that Vanessa couldn't quite read. "A promise to who, though? Paul's not here anymore, and his mama never even talks to you." That had stung because it was true. After the funeral, Dorothy had cut off all contact with Vanessa. When Vanessa had tried to call her that first Christmas, Dorothy had answered with a cold, "What do you want?" When Vanessa had said she just wanted to check in, see how Dorothy was doing, Dorothy had said, "I'm managing," and hung up. Vanessa had tried twice more over the years, and each time Dorothy's responses had been brief and dismissive. Eventually, Vanessa had stopped calling, but she never stopped sending the money. It was the promise, the sacred promise she'd made to Paul as he lay dying. That promise was all she had left of him, the last thing he'd asked of her, and she wore it like a chain around her neck, heavy and inescapable. Now sitting in her apartment with that returned envelope in her hands and the neighbor's note burning her eyes, Vanessa felt something crack inside her chest. A luxury condo in Buckhead. Buckhead was one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Atlanta, where condos started at $500,000 and went up from there, where people drove luxury cars and shopped at stores Vanessa couldn't even afford to walk into. Dorothy had been living there for 3 years, while Vanessa sent her money every month. While Vanessa wore threadbare clothes and ate budget meals and worked herself to exhaustion, while Vanessa honored a promise that Dorothy apparently didn't need her to keep. Vanessa's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. She searched for Dorothy's name online, something she'd never thought to do before. Why would she? She'd trusted Paul. She trusted that he knew his mother's situation. But now, as search results populated her screen, Vanessa felt the room start to spin. There was Dorothy's Facebook page, public and full of photos. Dorothy at a wine tasting? Dorothy on a cruise ship, the ocean sparkling behind her, a cocktail in her hand. Dorothy at a fancy restaurant, plates of expensive food artfully arranged before her. Dorothy standing in front of a sleek, modern condo building, the caption reading, "Blessed to be living my best life in beautiful Buckhead." The photos went back 3 years, just like the neighbor had said. But as Vanessa scrolled further, her breath caught in her throat. There were photos from 4 years ago, 5 years ago, even 6 years ago. Dorothy at the Fox Theater. Dorothy shopping on Peachtree Street, designer bags hanging from her arms. Dorothy at a spa, cucumber slices over her eyes, captioning it, "Self-Care Sunday." These photos were dated to just months after Paul had died, months after Vanessa had started sending her money. Dorothy hadn't been struggling. She'd been thriving. Vanessa clicked on Dorothy's profile information. Listed under employment was retired legal secretary, 30-year pension. Vanessa's teaching salary was barely $45,000 a year, and she'd been supplementing Dorothy's pension, which was probably more than Vanessa made. She scrolled through more photos and found ones of Dorothy with her friends, well-dressed women her age, all of them smiling at cameras in restaurants and gardens and concert halls. In one photo from 2 years ago, Dorothy was wearing a necklace that looked expensive, sapphires or something similar, glinting in the light. The caption read, "Treating myself because I deserve it. Paul would want his mama to be happy?" Paul would want his mama to be happy. The words echoed in Vanessa's mind, bitter and mocking. Paul had wanted his mother taken care of, yes, but he'd also wanted Vanessa to be happy. He'd told her that many times. "Baby," he used to say, pulling her close after a long day, "I just want you to have everything you deserve. You work so hard, you love so big. I want to give you the world." But he died before he could, and Vanessa had spent 7 years giving pieces of herself away to honor his memory, believing she was doing something noble and necessary. Vanessa felt tears streaming down her face, hot and angry. She wasn't crying from sadness. She was crying from rage, from betrayal, from the crushing weight of realization. Dorothy had known. Dorothy had known exactly what she was doing. She'd taken Vanessa's money month after month, year after year, without a word of gratitude, without ever telling Vanessa the truth. She'd let Vanessa struggle and sacrifice while she'd lived comfortably, even luxuriously. She'd been so cold to Vanessa, so dismissive, and now Vanessa understood why. It wasn't grief, it was contempt. Dorothy had looked down on Vanessa from the very beginning, and she'd had no qualms about taking from someone she clearly considered beneath her. Vanessa stood up, her legs unsteady, and walked to her small kitchen. She opened the cabinet where she kept her financial records, pulling out the folder where she tracked every check she'd sent to Dorothy. She documented everything meticulously, partly out of habit from being a teacher, partly because it felt important to honor Paul's request properly. She laid the records out on her kitchen table, which was really just a small round table she'd bought at a yard sale. And she started to calculate. $250 a month for 7 years, 84 months, $21,000. $21,000 that Vanessa had scraped together through sacrifice and exhaustion. Money that could have changed her life. Money that she'd sent to a woman who hadn't needed it, hadn't wanted it from her, and certainly hadn't appreciated it. $21,000. Vanessa thought about what that money could have meant for her. She could have paid off a significant portion of Paul's medical debt, which still hung over her head. She could have bought a reliable car instead of riding the bus everywhere, because her 15-year-old sedan had finally died 3 years ago, and she couldn't afford to fix it. She could have taken a real vacation, something more than the day trips to free museums she allowed herself once or twice a year. She could have bought new clothes, gotten her teeth fixed. There was a crown she needed but couldn't afford, saved for a down payment on a small house. She could have lived like a person instead of a ghost, haunting her own life. Vanessa sat down at the table, her head in her hands, and she let herself feel everything she'd been holding back for 7 years. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the aching sense of loss that never quite went away. Paul had been everything to her, her best friend, her partner, her safe place in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. When he died, a part of Vanessa had died with him, and she'd been living in the shadow of that loss ever since, trying to honor him, trying to be worthy of the love he'd given her. But in doing so, she'd lost herself. She'd become small and tired and invisible, a woman who existed only to fulfill a promise to a dead man and support a living woman who despised her. The anger that Vanessa felt sitting at her kitchen table wasn't the explosive kind. It was cold and clarifying, burning through the fog of grief and obligation that had clouded her mind for 7 years. She'd been so focused on keeping her promise to Paul that she'd never stopped to question whether the promise was based on truth. Paul had believed his mother needed help. He'd grown up watching Dorothy work long hours, sacrifice for him, do without so he could have what he needed. In his mind, Dorothy was vulnerable and alone. But Paul had been wrong, or maybe Dorothy had lied to him too, playing the role of the struggling single mother so well that even her own son believed it. Vanessa picked up her phone again and went back to Dorothy's Facebook page. She started reading through the comments on Dorothy's posts, looking for clues for anything that might help her understand. Under a photo of Dorothy at a fancy brunch spot, someone had commented, "Girl, that settlement money is treating you right." Dorothy had responded with a laughing emoji, "And you know it! Paul made sure I was taken care of." Settlement money. Vanessa's heart started pounding. What settlement money? Paul had died of a heart attack at work. There had been no settlement, at least not one that Vanessa knew about. She'd received a small life insurance payout, barely enough to cover the funeral and a few months of bills. But a settlement? Vanessa searched deeper, going back through years of posts. Finally, she found it, a post from about 2 months after Paul died. Dorothy had written, "Justice for my baby boy. The company settled today. They knew something was wrong with their workplace conditions and they did nothing. Money won't bring Paul back, but at least they're being held accountable. Paul provided for me even in death." There were dozens of sympathetic comments, people saying they were sorry for her loss, glad she was being taken care of. Vanessa felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Paul's company had settled with Dorothy. There'd been some kind of workplace safety issue, and they'd paid out to avoid a lawsuit or liability. And Dorothy had never said a word to Vanessa about it. Vanessa thought back to those weeks after Paul died. The blur of grief and paperwork and people offering condolences that felt hollow. She remembered sitting in a lawyer's office, someone from Paul's company explaining the life insurance, handing her papers to sign. She remembered Dorothy being there, sitting stiff and silent in the corner, her face a mask of grief. Had Dorothy met with lawyers separately? Had she pursued a claim that Vanessa hadn't even known about? Paul's death had happened at work. Yes, but Vanessa had been told it was a heart attack, a medical event, tragic but not the company's fault. But maybe there was more to it. Maybe the stress of the job, the conditions, something had contributed. And maybe Dorothy had known that, had pursued it, had gotten a settlement that she'd never disclosed. Vanessa felt sick. She got up and paced her small apartment. 4 steps to the window, 4 steps back, over and over. Her mind was racing, connecting pieces she'd never thought to put together. Paul had asked her to send his mother $250 a month. That specific amount. Why that amount? At the time, Vanessa had assumed Paul knew what his mother's expenses were, that he'd calculated what she'd need. But now Vanessa wondered if Paul had simply been thinking of what Vanessa could afford, what wouldn't completely destroy her financially. Maybe he'd been trying to protect both of them, his mother and his wife, not knowing that his mother would soon have more money than she needed. Or maybe, and this thought made Vanessa's stomach turn, maybe Dorothy had lied to Paul too. Maybe she'd made herself seem more vulnerable than she was, exaggerated her financial struggles, manipulated her son into worrying about her. Vanessa had seen it happen with her own students' families over the years, parents who guilted their adult children into supporting them even when they didn't need it, who played on love and obligation to maintain control. Dorothy had always been controlling with Paul. Vanessa remembered how Paul would tense up whenever his mother called, how he'd carefully phrase things to avoid setting her off, how he'd apologize for his mother's coldness toward Vanessa, but never quite managed to stand up to her. Vanessa sat back down and opened her laptop. She needed to know more. She searched for information about workplace settlements, about how they were handled when someone died. She learned that settlements could be substantial, especially if there was clear negligence. She learned that settlements often went to the next of kin, which in Paul's case would have been Vanessa as his wife, unless Dorothy had been listed as a beneficiary or had pursued her own claim as his mother. Vanessa didn't understand all the legal intricacies, but she understood enough to know that Dorothy had come into money after Paul died, possibly a lot of it, and had chosen to hide that fact from Vanessa while accepting Vanessa's monthly checks. The betrayal cut deeper than Vanessa had thought possible. It wasn't just about the money, though. $21,000 was a fortune to someone like Vanessa, who lived paycheck to paycheck. It was about the trust, the promise, the belief that she was doing something meaningful, something that would make Paul proud. She'd sacrificed so much, and for what? To pad the bank account of a woman who'd never loved her, never respected her, never even pretended to be grateful? Dorothy had looked at Vanessa's sacrifice and seen it as her due, as something she was owed simply for having given birth to the man Vanessa loved. Vanessa thought about calling Dorothy right then, confronting her, demanding answers, but something held her back. Maybe it was the teacher in her, the part that believed in gathering all the facts before acting. Maybe it was self-preservation, knowing that if she called Dorothy now, in this state of fury and hurt, she'd say things she couldn't take back. Or maybe, and this felt closest to the truth, maybe she wanted to be strategic. Dorothy had been strategic with her, cold and calculating. Vanessa could be strategic too. She could be smart about this. She could make sure that when she confronted Dorothy, she had all her ammunition ready. So instead of calling, Vanessa spent the next several hours researching. She found the name of Paul's former employer and called their human resources department the next morning, saying she was Paul's widow and had questions about settlements that might have been paid out after his death. The woman on the phone was sympathetic but firm. She couldn't discuss details of settlements due to confidentiality agreements, but she could confirm that any settlement related to Paul's death would have been handled through the legal department and would have required signed releases from all parties. She suggested Vanessa contact a lawyer if she had concerns about how settlement funds were distributed. Vanessa thanked her and hung up, her mind working. She couldn't afford a lawyer, not really, but she knew someone who might help. Her cousin Marcus was a paralegal at a small firm in Decatur. She called him that evening after school and explained the situation. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he let out a long whistle. "Nessa, that's messed up. That's really messed up. Look, I can't give you legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. But I can tell you this. If there was a settlement and you weren't informed, that could be a problem, especially if you were his legal spouse and should have been included. But honestly, if his mother pursued it separately and the company settled with her, there might not be much you can do about it legally. The real issue here is that she lied to you, or at least let you believe a lie, and took your money knowing she didn't need it. Can I get my money back?" Vanessa asked, hating how her voice shook. "All those checks I sent her, can I do anything about that?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's tricky. You gave her the money voluntarily. You weren't coerced, at least not legally. Morally, yeah, it's wrong as hell, but proving that in court? It'd be expensive, and there's no guarantee you'd win. Small claims court, maybe, but even then, she could argue it was a gift, that she never asked you for it." Vanessa felt tears welling up again. So she just gets away with it? She just keeps all of it, both the settlement and my money, and there's nothing I can do? Marcus sighed. "Legally, maybe, but Nessa, there's more than one kind of justice in this world. Sometimes you have to get creative." Vanessa didn't know what he meant, but she thanked him and hung up. She sat in her apartment as the sun set outside her window, the light fading, shadows stretching across her worn furniture and bare walls. She thought about Paul, about the man he'd been. He'd been good and kind and honest, sometimes to a fault. He trusted people, believed the best in them, including his mother. If he'd known the truth, if he'd known how Dorothy would treat Vanessa, would he have still asked her to make that promise? Vanessa didn't think so. Paul had loved his mother, but he'd loved Vanessa more. He'd shown her that every day they were together. He would never have wanted her to suffer. That thought released something in Vanessa, a knot of guilt she'd been carrying for 7 years. She'd believed that keeping her promise was the same as honoring Paul's memory, but now she saw it differently. Honoring Paul meant living the kind of life he'd wanted for her, a life full of joy and possibility, not martyrdom. Paul had wanted her to take care of his mother, yes, but he'd also wanted his mother to be the kind of person who deserved that care. Dorothy wasn't. Dorothy had shown her true character through her actions, and Vanessa was finally allowing herself to see it clearly. The next day was Saturday, and Vanessa made a decision. She was going to Buckhead. She was going to find Dorothy's luxury condo, and she was going to confront her face to face. But she wasn't going to go in angry and emotional. She was going to be calm, collected, armed with facts. She printed out all her financial records, every check she'd sent, every sacrifice she'd made. She printed out screenshots of Dorothy's Facebook posts, the ones showing her lavish lifestyle, the ones mentioning the settlement. She put everything in a folder, neat and organized, the way she'd organized materials for a parent-teacher conference. She was going to treat this like what it was, an accounting, a reckoning. Vanessa borrowed LaToya's car, promising to explain everything later. She drove to Buckhead on Saturday morning, her stomach churning with anxiety and adrenaline. The neighborhood was even more beautiful and intimidating than she'd imagined. Tree-lined streets with manicured lawns, modern buildings with glass facades, people jogging in expensive athletic wear, walking designer dogs. She found Dorothy's building easily enough, the name from Facebook matching the directory. It was a sleek high-rise with a doorman, The kind of place where the monthly HOA fees were probably more than Vanessa's rent. Vanessa parked across the street and sat in the car for a long moment, gathering her courage. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. She was wearing her best outfit, though even her best was shabby by Buckhead standards. A simple black dress and cardigan, flats that were comfortable because she'd worn them so many times. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she'd put on a little makeup, wanting to look presentable, wanting to feel like she had some dignity in this moment. She took a deep breath, grabbed her folder, and got out of the car. The doorman smiled at her politely as she approached. "Good morning. Who are you here to see?" Vanessa hesitated, then said, "Dorothy Richardson. I'm her daughter-in-law, Vanessa." The doorman checked his computer, picked up a phone, and called up to Dorothy's unit. Vanessa's heart pounded as she waited. What if Dorothy refused to see her? What if the doorman turned her away? But after a moment, the doorman nodded and hung up. "She says you can come up. 15th floor, unit 1507. Vanessa thanked him and walked to the elevators on shaking legs. The elevator ride up felt like it took forever and no time at all. Vanessa watched the numbers climb, her reflection staring back at her from the polished metal doors. She looked small and tired and scared, and she hated it. By the time the doors opened on the 15th floor, she'd straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She was here. She was doing this. She found unit 1507 and knocked. 3 firm raps that sounded braver than she felt. Dorothy opened the door, and for a moment they just stared at each other. Dorothy looked good, better than Vanessa had ever seen her. She'd gained a little weight, the kind that came from eating well and living without stress. Her hair was done, relaxed and styled, and she was wearing a beautiful cashmere sweater and slacks that probably cost more than Vanessa's monthly grocery budget. She looked like what she was, a woman who was comfortable, who was thriving, who had not a care in the world. When she saw Vanessa, her expression didn't change much, just a slight tightening around her eyes. "Vanessa," Dorothy said, her voice flat, "this is unexpected." Vanessa forced herself to stay calm. "I need to talk to you, Dorothy. Can I come in?" Dorothy hesitated, clearly wanting to say no, but perhaps some small part of her recognized that this conversation was inevitable. She stepped aside and Vanessa walked into the condo. It was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows with views of the Atlanta skyline, hardwood floors, modern furniture that looked like it came from expensive showrooms, artwork on the walls, fresh flowers on the dining room table. This was a home that cost real money, not just to buy, but to maintain. Vanessa felt a surge of anger so intense she had to clench her fists to keep her hands from shaking. Dorothy didn't offer Vanessa a seat, but Vanessa sat down anyway on a pristine white sofa that probably cost more than her car used to be worth. She placed her folder on the glass coffee table and looked up at Dorothy, who remained standing, arms crossed, her face a mask of cold indifference. Vanessa had rehearsed this moment in her mind, planned what she'd say, but now that she was here, the words came out raw and unfiltered. "Why did you let me keep sending you money when you didn't need it?" Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "I don't know what you're talking about." But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of defensiveness, that told Vanessa she knew exactly what this was about. Vanessa opened her folder and pulled out the first document, her financial records. "I've sent you $250 every month for 7 years, $21,000 total. I did it because Paul asked me to, because he made me promise to take care of you. But you didn't need it, did you, Dorothy? You never needed it." Dorothy's expression hardened. "What Paul asked you to do is between you and him. It's not my concern whether you could afford it or not." The casual cruelty of those words took Vanessa's breath away. She pulled out the screenshots of Dorothy's Facebook posts, spreading them across the table. "You got a settlement from Paul's company, a substantial one from what I can tell. You've been living here, living like this, for 3 years. You were comfortable even before that, and you never once told me. You never once said, 'Vanessa, thank you, but I don't need your money.' You just kept taking it." Dorothy glanced at the photos with disdain. "You've been stalking my social media? That's pathetic, Vanessa." Vanessa felt her control slipping. What's pathetic is taking money from a woman who could barely afford to feed herself. What's pathetic is letting me work 2 jobs to support you when you were living in a luxury condo. What's pathetic is lying to your son, letting him die thinking you needed help when you didn't. That struck a nerve. Dorothy's face flushed and she stepped forward, her voice rising. Don't you dare talk about my son. You don't know anything about what he wanted or what he would have thought. He asked you to take care of me because he loved me, because I'm his mother, and you should have been honored to do it. That money was the least you could do after taking him away from me. Vanessa stood up, her own anger finally matching Dorothy's. Taking him away from you? I love Paul. I was his wife. I didn't take him from anyone. And you know what? If Paul knew the truth about you, if he knew how you treated me, how you've been living while I've been struggling, he'd be ashamed. He'd be so ashamed of you, Dorothy. Dorothy slapped her. The sound cracked through the apartment, sharp and shocking. Vanessa's face stung, her cheek burning, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Dorothy said, her voice low and venomous, Get out of my house. You have no right to come here, to judge me, to throw accusations around. Paul left you that life insurance money. What I got from the company was mine, compensation for losing my son. You have no claim to it, and you never will. The money you sent me? Consider it rent for all the years you had Paul, for taking away the only person who ever mattered to me. Vanessa touched her cheek, feeling the heat of the slap, but instead of crying, instead of shrinking away, she felt something else. Clarity. She'd spent 7 years believing she owed Dorothy something, believing that her promise to Paul meant she had to accept whatever Dorothy dealt out. But she didn't. She didn't owe this woman anything. Not her money, not her time, not her respect. You're right, Vanessa said quietly. I have no legal claim to that settlement money. But you have no moral claim to the $21,000 I sent you. That money came from my sacrifice, from my love for Paul, and you took it without a second thought because you're greedy and bitter, and you've been punishing me for having what you couldn't have, your son's heart. Dorothy's face twisted. He was mine first. I raised him. I sacrificed everything for him. And then you showed up, and suddenly I wasn't enough anymore. He chose you over me, over and over. And then he died and left me with nothing but guilt and grief. So yes, I took your money. I took it because you deserved to feel a fraction of what I felt. You deserved to struggle. There it was. The truth, ugly and raw. Dorothy hadn't needed the money. She'd wanted Vanessa to suffer. She'd wanted to punish her for being loved by Paul. Vanessa felt a strange sense of release, hearing it spoken out loud. All these years, she'd blamed herself for Dorothy's coldness, wondered what she'd done wrong, how she could have been a better daughter-in-law. But it was never about her. It was about Dorothy's own bitterness, her inability to let her son be happy with someone else. Vanessa picked up her folder, carefully putting all the documents back inside. I'm not going to sue you, Dorothy. I don't have the money for lawyers, and honestly, I don't want to spend another minute of my life tangled up with you. But I want you to know that I'm done. No more checks, no more trying to honor a promise that was based on a lie. You can keep the money you've already taken, but you won't get another cent from me. She walked toward the door, then turned back. And one more thing. Paul loved you, despite everything. He loved you enough to worry about you with his dying breath. That's the kind of man he was. But he loved me too, and he wouldn't want me to keep sacrificing myself for someone who never cared about me. So I'm choosing to honor Paul by living the life he wanted for me, not the life you think I deserve. Dorothy said nothing, just stood there with her arms crossed, her face a storm of emotions Vanessa couldn't read and didn't care to. Vanessa walked out of the condo, down the hallway into the elevator and out of the building. She didn't cry until she was back in LaToya's car, and even then the tears were more from relief than sadness. She'd done it. She'd confronted Dorothy. She'd said what needed to be said, and now she was free. Over the next few months, Vanessa's life began to change in small but significant ways. Without the burden of sending $250 to Dorothy every month, she had breathing room in her budget. She paid off a chunk of Paul's old medical debt. She bought herself some new clothes, nothing extravagant, but things that fit properly and made her feel like herself again. She got her car situation sorted out. buying a modest used sedan that ran well. She started saying yes when her friends invited her out, rediscovering the joy of connection and laughter. She even went on a few dates, nothing serious, but it felt good to remember that she was still a woman with desires and dreams, not just a widow fulfilling a promise. But the story didn't end there, because Dorothy wasn't willing to let it go. About 3 months after their confrontation, Vanessa started receiving phone calls from family members, distant relatives she hadn't heard from in years, asking her what was going on with Dorothy. Apparently, Dorothy had been telling everyone that Vanessa had abandoned her, that she'd cut off the financial support Paul had wanted her to provide, that Vanessa was ungrateful and cruel. Dorothy had painted herself as the victim, the poor grieving mother abandoned by her ungrateful daughter-in-law. At first, Vanessa tried to explain to each person who called, giving them the full story. But it was exhausting. Some people believed her, some didn't, and some just wanted to stay out of it. Vanessa realized that Dorothy was trying to manipulate the narrative, to turn people against her, and she felt that old anger rising up again. But then LaToya gave her some advice that changed everything. Girl, stop trying to convince people who don't matter. You know the truth. The people who really know you, they know the truth. Let Dorothy tell her lies. Eventually, people will see who she really is. LaToya was right, but Vanessa decided to do one thing to protect herself. She wrote a letter, a calm, factual account of everything that had happened. She included copies of her financial records showing the money she'd sent, screenshots of Dorothy's Facebook posts showing her lifestyle, and a brief explanation of the settlement Dorothy had received. She didn't send it to everyone, just to the few family members who mattered to her, people who'd been kind to her over the years, and she included a note saying, "I'm not asking you to take sides, I just want you to know the truth. Dorothy has every right to her feelings, but she doesn't have the right to lie about me." The response was overwhelming. Almost everyone who received the letter reached out to Vanessa with support and apologies. They'd had no idea what Dorothy had been doing. Some of them admitted they'd always found Dorothy difficult, that this behavior fit a pattern they'd seen before. A few of them confronted Dorothy directly, demanding to know why she'd lied, and slowly Dorothy's version of events began to crumble. People stopped taking her calls. Her social media posts garnered fewer and fewer likes and comments. The community she'd built around her victim narrative began to see through it. About a year after Vanessa's confrontation with Dorothy, something unexpected happened. Vanessa got a message on Facebook from Dorothy's younger sister Pauline, a woman Vanessa had only met a handful of times at family gatherings. Pauline asked if they could meet for coffee, and Vanessa, curious, agreed. They met at a small cafe in Midtown, and Pauline got straight to the point. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I knew Dorothy got that settlement. I knew she didn't need your money, but I didn't say anything because honestly, I was afraid of her. Dorothy has always been the kind of person who cuts people off if they cross her. I should have spoken up, especially after Paul died." "I'm sorry." Vanessa was stunned. "You knew? All this time?" Pauline nodded, looking miserable. "Dorothy told me about the settlement right after it came through. She was excited about it, said it was going to set her up for life. When I asked her if you knew, she just laughed and said it was none of your business. I thought she'd tell you eventually, or that you'd figure it out. But then years went by and I realized she was just going to keep taking your money. I tried to bring it up once, and she threatened to cut me off completely. We're the only family each other has left, and I was scared of losing her." Pauline reached across the table and took Vanessa's hand. "But after everything that's happened, after seeing how she treated you, I can't stay silent anymore. Dorothy is my sister, but what she did to you was wrong. You deserve to know that someone in the family sees that." They talked for over an hour, and by the end of it, Vanessa felt something she hadn't felt in a long time when it came to Paul's family. Connection. Pauline wasn't trying to make excuses for Dorothy or convince Vanessa to reconcile with her. She was simply acknowledging the truth and offering support. They exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch. And they did. Pauline became an unexpected friend, someone who understood the complicated grief of loving someone despite their flaws and knowing when to draw boundaries. As for Dorothy, Vanessa heard through the grapevine that she'd become more isolated. The friends who used to comment on her Facebook posts had drifted away. Family members kept their distance. She still lived in her Buckhead condo, still had her settlement money, but she didn't have the one thing she'd always craved: control over how people saw her. The narrative she'd tried to build of the devoted mother wronged by an ungrateful daughter-in-law had fallen apart under the weight of evidence and truth. People knew now what she'd done, and while they might not confront her directly, they didn't support her lies anymore either. Vanessa didn't take pleasure in Dorothy's isolation, but she didn't feel guilty about it either. Dorothy had made her choices. She'd chosen bitterness over love, manipulation over honesty, and now she was living with the consequences. Vanessa had made different choices. She'd chosen to tell the truth, to set boundaries, to reclaim her life and her dignity. And those choices had led her to a better place. 2 years after the confrontation, Vanessa met someone. His name was Marcus, not her cousin, but a different Marcus, a kind man who taught music at a high school across town. They met at a professional development workshop, bonded over their shared love of education and their mutual frustration with standardized testing, and eventually started dating. Marcus knew about Paul from the beginning. Vanessa was honest about her past, about her grief, about the promise she'd kept, and the betrayal she'd uncovered. Marcus listened without judgment and told her, "You honored your love the best way you knew how. That's what matters. Now you get to honor yourself." Vanessa fell in love with Marcus slowly, carefully, in a way that felt different from her love for Paul, but no less real. Paul had been her first great love, the man who'd shown her what partnership could be. Marcus was her second chance, the man who reminded her that she deserved happiness and companionship, that her life wasn't over just because Paul's had ended. They got engaged on a quiet Sunday morning, no grand gestures, just the two of them and a simple question: "Will you build a life with me?" Vanessa said yes. She thought about Paul often, especially in the planning stages of her wedding to Marcus. She wondered what Paul would think, whether he'd be happy for her or hurt that she'd moved on. But deep down, Vanessa knew the answer. Paul had loved her enough to want her happiness above all else. He would have wanted her to find love again, to live fully, to not spend her life as a monument to his memory. So when she walked down the aisle to Marcus, she wore a small locket around her neck with Paul's picture inside, a quiet acknowledgement that love doesn't end. It transforms. Dorothy was not invited to the wedding. Vanessa didn't send her an announcement or an explanation. She simply moved forward with her life, and Dorothy was not a part of it. She heard from Pauline that Dorothy had seen the wedding photos on Facebook, that she'd made some bitter comments about Vanessa forgetting Paul, but Vanessa didn't engage. She'd learned that some people will never be satisfied, will never admit fault, will never change. Dorothy was one of those people, and Vanessa had wasted enough years trying to win her approval or understanding. Now, 5 years after that confrontation in the Buckhead condo, Vanessa's life looks completely different. She and Marcus own a small house in Decatur with a backyard where they grow tomatoes and herbs. She still teaches second grade, still loves her students with the same fierce dedication she's always had. She's paid off Paul's medical debt entirely, a weight lifted that she'd carried for over a decade. She has savings now, a modest emergency fund that gives her peace of mind. She takes vacations, short trips to the beach or the mountains, nothing extravagant but enough to feel like she's living, not just surviving. And every month, on the day she used to write a check to Dorothy, Vanessa does something different. She donates $50 to a charity that supports widows and widowers, helping people who are navigating grief and financial hardship. It's her way of honoring Paul's original intention, to help someone who actually needs it, while also honoring herself, keeping the money she worked so hard for and using it to build the life she deserves. The rest of that $250 goes into savings, into her future, into the dreams she'd put on hold for so long. Vanessa thinks about forgiveness sometimes, whether she's forgiven Dorothy for what she did. The answer is complicated. She's forgiven Dorothy in the sense that she's let go of the anger, the bitterness, the need for revenge or justice beyond what truth provided. She doesn't wish Dorothy harm. She doesn't spend her days thinking about what Dorothy did to her. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen or opening herself up to be hurt again. Vanessa has forgiven Dorothy enough to move on with her life, but not enough to let Dorothy back into it. and she's at peace with that. The story of Vanessa and Dorothy is a story about promises and how we keep them, about love and how it can be manipulated, about sacrifice and when it becomes self-destruction. It's a story about discovering that honoring someone you've lost doesn't mean destroying yourself for someone who doesn't value you. It's about finding the strength to say enough, to reclaim your life, to choose yourself even when it feels selfish or wrong. And ultimately, it's a story about the kind of justice that doesn't come from courts or confrontations, but from living well, from building a life that's full and meaningful and true. Vanessa still misses Paul. She always will. But she doesn't live in the shadow of his death anymore. She lives in the light of his love, the love that believes she deserved everything good, everything beautiful, everything joyful that life had to offer. And by living that way, by refusing to be diminished by Dorothy's cruelty or bound by a promise built on lies, Vanessa has honored Paul more truly than any check she ever wrote. She's honored him by becoming the woman he always knew she could be, strong, resilient, deserving of love, and finally free.